Hello, my name is Dan Rose, and I'm the CEO of LymFlow, and I'm here today with two of the world's leading experts in the treatment of chronic limb-threatening ischemia, Dr. Mehdi Shishehbor and Dr. Dan Clair. It would be great if you two could introduce yourselves. Dr. Shishehbor?
Yeah, I'm Mehdi Shishehbor, interventional cardiologist. I'm the president of University Hospital's Harrington Heart and Vascular Institute in Cleveland, Ohio.
And I'm Dan Clair. I'm the chair of vascular surgery at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville.
Well, I know both of you have, previous to working on the PROMISE 2 trial and with LymFlow, you both had been involved in one way or another with venous arterialization beforehand. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience beforehand and your thoughts on the therapy coming into working with LymFlow and with the PROMISE trials? Dan?
So, venous arterialization in the surgical world has been around a long time. And it was not really until the 1960s and 70s where there was an understanding of the fact that you needed to get venous blood flow if you were going to divert arterial blood flow in the veins beyond the valves into the foot itself. And I'd heard about a company doing this probably now 7 or 8 years ago. And I think anybody who practices in the space of critical limb ischemia has patients where we can't offer them standard arterial reconstruction. And so I actually had a very strong interest from early on. And I have to say, my early experience with the technology was through the PROMISE 1 trial. And I had very, very incredible results for patients that I thought were assuredly going to have below-knee amputations, and we were able to save their limbs. And that, has been strengthened the more I've done these procedures and the more I've gotten along in the trials, the PROMISE 1 and the PROMISE 2 trial.
Dan, for me, obviously we always like innovation and new technology. But what really attracted me to this was the fact that I felt that this is a technology that gives hope. The hardest thing for us as physicians is to tell the patient that there is no hope, that you're going to lose your leg or your life. And when I heard that this was a technology for no option patients, people that would be basically having to deal with a major amputation, it's really got me excited. And like Dan, I reached out 7, 8 years ago and had the opportunity to work with you guys through PROMISE 1 and now PROMISE 2.
Great, and perhaps you can talk a little bit about this patient population, which is, unique in the sense that it had never really been studied before in a prospective trial, but maybe you can just talk about typically how these patients present, what their life is like with where their disease has progressed to, and what is the reality of their option or not going forward. So.
Yeah, this has been, in my opinion, I think this has been one of the biggest challenges in this field. I would say, I hate to use the word, frustration for us as physicians, as clinicians that treat this condition. And the people that need the most innovation were the ones that were excluded from these trials. We're talking about Rutherford 6, advanced gangrene, end-stage renal disease, people that had no options. And these are the kind of patients that typically have been excluded from all the trials that we have studied with balloons and stents and those kind of technologies. So this was very unique. It was very exciting to be able to include patients that typically would not have the opportunity to be part of a trial or innovation that could help them.
And I think the other thing about these patients, Mehdi, as well, was that these were not just patients whom you or I said didn't have an option. There was a group of vascular surgeons who oversaw enrollment and assured that all of these patients really did not have any potential for arterial revascularization in the foot itself. And this is unlike the VEGF trials or the other trials that looked at angiogenesis. None of those trials had anyone looking over the investigator's shoulder to say, yeah, these really are patients who have no other option for treatment. And you're right, they've not been included in any other trial. I actually don't think they're described very well in the literature because these are patients who go to amputation.
In most peripheral artery disease CLTI trials, typically the endpoint is around patency. That's what we're looking for, to see if the devices we're introducing can keep the vessel open for a long time. The Promise 1 and Promise 2 trials had a different approach to endpoints, amputation-free survival, what we think of as very hard endpoints. But what do you think is really the definition of success, long-term success for these patients and their progression and outcomes?
So I think, quite frankly, the neat thing about the trial is that amputation-free survival is a very patient-centered outcome. The fact that they still have their limb, that they're ambulatory, most of these patients, that's the goal, is to get them ambulatory, get them out of pain, get their wound healed, and get them back to functioning like they were before. And one of the advantages to this particular technique is that it does it without requiring a large wound for these patients to recover from. I mean, from my standpoint, I define the ideal outcome for these patients is to get back to functioning at the level of function, maybe even better than they were before we did the procedure.
Yeah, Dan, both Dan and I have been very outspoken about this. At the end of the day, why are we treating CLTI? This is a very different condition than claudication. For claudication is symptoms of pain, and patency is relevant to that. For us, is about limb salvage and wound healing. Those are the two most important. You can have all the arteries open. If the wound is not healing, then we didn't reach the outcome that is patient-centric. Mm-hmm. So the patient-centric outcomes, in my opinion, for these type of patients that have CLTI and advanced gangrene and ulcer, is amputation-free survival, wound healing, and quality of life.
Right. Because maintaining mobility, ultimately, when you lose that, I mean, what we observe, I think, in the literature, and what you must observe, is that patients really go downhill when they lose that. Even if it's not mortality immediately, it's kind of in a way the trigger for a progression of the disease and morbidity.
Absolutely. I mean, 50% of patients that undergo amputation die within 2 years. Now, that death is usually cardiovascular, but imagine if you cannot move, if you cannot exercise, you cannot walk, on top of depression and all the other social impacts that amputation has on you. I think it's no wonder that they have such a high mortality. So if we can help with that, I think we can also reduce mortality in these patients. We have to prove that, but the first step is to save their limb.
For sure.
And I think even beyond that, the amputation is something that affects a patient, but it also affects their family. I mean, these are elderly patients who, many situations, have been able to live either independently or with assisted living, maybe living with a family member. And once they have an amputation, many times they wind up being institutionalized in a long-term care facility because they can't handle, or the family can't handle, immobility and loss of a limb. It affects more than just the patient themselves. And that's, again, the value of a therapy like this, because it really doesn't just affect the patient, it affects their families as well.
It's so true, because we see, Dan, we see families bring their loved ones for hours to our centers because they want to help them save their limb. In many cases, they don't even have the socioeconomic means to do it, but they want to support. I think you really hit on something very important. That is not just the patient, obviously they're at the center, but the families also gets impacted in the process of saving the limb and then after an amputation.
Absolutely. Given this is a different patient population than has been studied before, and we needed to design a trial that would fit that patient population, and also the fact that we're introducing a novel therapy, right, a different mechanism of action, and trying to do that in the sickest patient population that has ever been prospectively really treated with CLTI. What were some of the things that we had to think about and that you were concerned about in shaping the trial as we defined Promise 1 and Promise 2?
So I would say, just defining the patient population and assuring we had well represented, the group of patients that we were trying to get. So these are patients who have no standard option. They're at extremely high risk for amputation. And many of those patients have a number of comorbidities, often renal insufficiency, cardiac disease. It's rare that these patients just have peripheral vascular disease. And I think designing a trial that includes these very sick patients, but doesn't have so many comorbidities that they're so ill otherwise. And I have to say, I don't think it's possible to do that. And I think that's one of the things that you see in this trial is that, there are high complication rates in this trial for patients who are treated because this is a really sick group of patients. And in addition to that, there are many things beyond just the novel therapy that can impact their outcomes. The wound care, the standards of care that we provide for these individuals. And then to try to tell these patients, well, this has not been tried in this fashion before, and we think it's going to benefit you, but I honestly can't even tell you 100% how exactly it's going to benefit you. I think those things were made recruiting in the trial and getting the trial designed very, very challenging.
Yeah, you said it very nicely, Dan. And to me, this is not a procedure. This is a treatment, and there's a difference. There's a difference between being a procedure and being a treatment. And a treatment involves a patient care model. Mm-hmm. We really had to, not only the points that Dr. Clair just mentioned, and in regards to patient identification and addressing the comorbidities and the challenges of these patients, but the level of education that even the investigators had to overcome as we conducted the trial, the education that had the interactions with our podiatry colleagues, our wound care specialists. Throughout this stage, really kudos to the patients, to the investigators, and to the company for uniting together and creating this care model around these patients. And always the goal was wound healing and amputation-free survival. And I think that this is what's so unique about this study. And that's why the difference between patency and amputation-free survival. Because when the focus is patency, is the focus on the procedure. This was a treatment to save limbs.
It's very different from a company's perspective to be involved with a trial, which is just a device going to a patient. And after you treat the patient, you walk away, right? And what we've seen with LymphFlow is that we hope we can be a catalyst for much more multidisciplinary, integrated wound care with the interventionalists, because that's one of the secrets of success here. And it's a secret of success, I think, not just for LymphFlow patients, but for every patient. But it's not everywhere. And so we hope that learning from the trial can carry forward as we are able to develop the therapy further.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think one of the other things that was unique about this trial was that all of the investigators, and this is the first trial I've ever been in, where all the investigators were in a group chat. And we could easily answer and receive questions about, what do you think about this? Is this, do I need to intervene here? Do I need to do something about this? Is this wound looking good, or does it look like it's not progressing? And I actually think that was very valuable for the trial and for us as interventionalists as well. And I don't know of another trial that's done that extensively in the way that we did in this trial.
Absolutely.
One of the unforeseen challenges of the PROMISE 2 trial was we began enrollment in December of 2019 and concluded enrollment in March of 2022. And something else also happened during that period, which was the pandemic. So can you talk a little bit about how the COVID-19 pandemic affected the enrollment of trial, the experience of patients, and even to a certain extent, the outcomes?
So I would say it dramatically impacted trial enrollment, trial progression, and running the trial overall, and probably elongated the time to getting to completion of the trial. So, we had, for a while, patients who were actually afraid to come to an emergency room. We were not seeing patients live in our office. We were mandated to see patients through telehealth visits. And it's impossible, in my view, to evaluate critical limb ischemia patients adequately with telehealth. And not only that, our nurses were not routinely in the office with patients. There were no family members with these patients. So some of them have mobility restrictions with the wounds that they have. And from literally enrollment all the way through follow-up, I think this really altered the way that the trial ran. I am very proud of the fact, and I think you as a company should be too, that you are able to complete enrollment, get actually really well-defined endpoints identified for these patients, and to actually do it in what's probably the most challenging environment I've ever worked in my experience.
It's really a testament to the commitment of interventionalists, surgeons, and physicians that want to take care of these patients and the need that is out there for these patients. It doesn't really matter, pandemic, COVID, shortage of nursing, the vacancies, the challenges with coming for your care. Still, we were able to complete the trial with fantastic follow-up and fantastic results.
So, we have the opportunity here at Viva this year in the late-breaking trials to present the outcomes, the 6-month outcomes, which is the primary endpoint outcomes for Promise 2. Can you each talk a little bit about the results and what is most impactful in your mind in terms of the outcomes we observed in this study?
Well, the results to me are incredible, Dan. 99% success rate of a complex procedure, something novel, new that we were doing percutaneously. That itself speaks volume to the company, but also the technology, that this can be done successfully, even though it's considered relatively involved. The second thing was the primary outcomes, 66% amputation-free survival and 76% limb salvage rate. In a population, at least in my center, I know these were patients that would have had a major amputation otherwise. I know we had to use kind of a performance goal for the study, for the statistics. But I know that in my institution, the kind of patients that I enrolled in this trial were those that would have either gone for major amputation or the limb flow opportunity. So to me, to save 2/3 of the patients that would have had major amputation from getting an amputation is huge.
And I would just emphasize that, Promise 1 was a much smaller number of patients in the hands of a much smaller group of interventionalists. And the outcomes were 75% amputation-free survival. This amputation-free survival for the entire group is slightly lower, but if you look at the population without the end-stage renal disease group, we have almost exactly the same limb salvage, 76%, I think, in the Promise 2 trial. And to me, that just says this really works. We really know that it does in patients with really complex disease. And we're really still at the beginning of learning how to do this best, and learning how best to manage these patients. I think we're at the bottom of what we're going to see for outcomes for these patients. And that, to me, is a really exciting part about this.
Absolutely.
That for us, from the company perspective as well, I mean, one of the decisions we took was to not require roll-in cases. So everybody's first case was in the trial, right? We had almost every discipline that does interventional CLTI patients in the trial. So different kinds of operators from different disciplines enrolling. And so there were those, when you see 99%, technical success out of that, I mean, that was tremendously reassuring for us. So it's been a big success from that point, but we weren't sure how it would go when we began.
The other thing, Dan, that we shouldn't fail to mention is the wound healing. It's incredible. At 6 months, we have had a quarter of the patients had their wound completely healed. Remember, these are patients that were Rutherford 6, Rutherford 5, advanced wounds. And about 50% of the patients were in the healing process, clean clothes with significantly smaller wound size, having undergone minor amputation. So I think that's another important endpoint, and I don't know if you agree, that is extremely important for this population.
I think that, and the other thing I think that's incredibly important is that we're moving patients. If you look at Rutherford categorization, we're moving patients from Rutherford 5 to Rutherford 0. I mean, these are patients who have no wounds, have no pain, and are walking on their limb without problems. I mean, I look at the change in Rutherford classification, and that to me is almost astounding.
Yeah.
I think about it all the time, and I completely agree. We've established the floor of where the outcomes are. When you start with a new therapy, very similar to what was done in TAVR, or it was done with AAA, with non-surgical candidates, you establish that you can make this technique and technology and therapy, because it's a mix of all three things, a success in those worst of the worst patient. You've established the floor of what you can do, because you don't have much experience. The technology is in its earlier generations. The physicians have very little experience themselves with managing the patients afterwards, and you're in the worst patients you're ever going to treat. So where can we go from there? I mean, if we continue to do our job in evolving the therapy and the technology, physicians continue to learn how to treat patients better, and we can really do something amazing here. And we're already pretty excited about what we see, but the next phase can be even better.
Yeah.
What does it mean to have this study published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and what impact do you think it'll have on the therapy?
Well, I think it just tells us that, as far as I know, in the field of PAD and CLTI, there has been no medical or devices that have had the potential to impact limb salvage. And the opportunity for this company to get FDA indication to use this technology for limb salvage will have a significant impact for our patients with CLTI, especially for no option patients, which is the cohort that was studied in this in LimFlow.
I also think that the publication in the New England Journal really sends a message to everybody dealing with these patients that this is a grounded therapy. It is accepted in the medical community at this point, and that I think for the therapy itself, it's essentially incredibly important that we have representation outside of sort of the classic journals that you'll see this represented in, to present it to the medical community as a whole, that this option is available, and your patients should be seeking it if they are felt not to have an option for standard revascularization.
I mean, it's really truly a paradigm shift, right? This is, instead of sending the patient for amputation, we are now offering a new treatment. I think the other aspect of this, Dan, I don't know if you agree, when you publish a paper or a randomized trial in New England Journal of Medicine, it really speaks of the validity and the design and the conduct of that trial. Because as you know, Dan, this is intense vetting. This is the highest level journal publication in medicine for us, and it's taken very seriously. So this trial, this publication was intensely vetted, evaluated by experts in the field, and they felt it was worthy of the publication in the highest journal in medicine.
I mean, it's a tremendous honor, I think, for everyone involved in the study. And at the same time, I mean, it's always felt to me that CLTI and limb salvage has not gotten the attention that it deserves. I'm always amazed when talking with friends and meeting people and I explain what I do. So often people are like, oh yeah, my father, amputated. My aunt died of sepsis due to a wound. I mean, the number of people, of patients suffering from this disease, but suffering quietly, is incredible. And given the rates of diabetes, given the rates of cardiovascular disease, and especially occurring in younger and younger patients, we're only going to see more and more patients in the future. But it doesn't get talked about in the literature. It doesn't get exposed in the press as it should. And we hope that this is a recognition that society needs to take this disease much more seriously than it has in the past. And New England Journal is a fantastic way to really put the challenge of late-stage critical limb ischemia front and center.
That's right.
And I think in addition to that, the fact that amputation rates in this country dropped after we started doing more interventional therapies, but that has flattened out. And for diabetics in particular, it's not had as dramatic an impact as it probably should have. And I think this therapy, particularly for those with longstanding diabetes, offers an option that really, I mean, this is the best thing to come across the table for them in the last 10 to 20 years of dealing with patients with this problem.
Another area, Dan, I know this is close to your heart too, is the disparities. We were very fortunate in PROMISE too. Almost half of our patients were either Hispanic or African American background. And we know that there is significant disparities for some of the reasons that you mentioned. from a socioeconomic status standpoint, from inability to ask for a second opinion. There is a huge disparities. African Americans are 4 times more likely to undergo amputation and 4 times less likely to get revascularization. And I think having that New England Journal of Medicine platform, I hope it will impact that disparity in amputation that currently exists in the United States.
Is there a patient from the study that really stands out to you?
So I actually have 2 patients, and I've talked about one of them before. The first patient I actually enrolled in the Promise 1 trial is an older woman who was still working and had only been offered amputation by 3 different physicians that she'd seen. And with the limb flow procedure, we were able to save her limb. And actually, she, after 2 years, was walking so well that she started developing chest pain and had to have open heart surgery for her angina. And 2 years later, she's now 5 years out from that procedure. She claudicates in the other leg. She has no claudication in the leg that we treated with deep vein arterialization. And interestingly enough, she continues to ambulate. And there's one other gentleman that I took care of this year. It's a gentleman I actually initially took care of in Cleveland almost 10 years ago when I was there. He'd originally been referred because they thought he needed amputation. He had very bad disease in his foot. We were able to revascularize a vessel in his foot, and I did a toe amputation and saved his foot. And he came back and said he'd seen several people and all he could get was offers for amputation. And that vasculature in his foot was now completely obliterated. And we were able to do this procedure on him. And he is walking now with his foot, almost completely healed his wounds, just about 6 or 7 months from the procedure itself. I mean, it's just really heartening to see some gentleman continue to be able to live his life independently like that.
Well, these cases, are not the ones you forget, Dan, as we have been discussing here. These are patients that are undergoing major amputation. There's a lot of family involvement. There's a lot of emotion. But the one case that I am most proud of, and I think you guys should also be proud of, is also my first patient in the Promise 1, which we ended up doing as a compassionate use, if you recall that. Yeah. And it was through the support of your company and my institution, University Hospitals, and FDA. We actually had to write to the FDA because Cynthia had a Church-Strauss, which is an autoimmune disease of the blood vessels. And because of that, she was not being considered in the study. And her story is so amazing because 3 years prior to that, she had come in with CLI. And because there was no lymph flow, and that's why we are here today, because there was no hope, she underwent a major amputation. So she's a 54-year-old grandma and mother who lost one leg 3 years prior. And now she comes in with an ulcer of the one leg that she has. And we had tried endovascular and Church-Strauss, small vessel disease. So there was no target. There was nothing for bypass. And we were able to offer her compassionate use lymph flow. I'm proud to say that 6 years later, she's walking, she is playing with her grandchildren, and we were able to save at least one of her legs so that she can be able to interact, walk, and have a reasonable life.
That's just fantastic.
Yeah.
What do you consider to be the key take-home messages from Promise 2, and what do you see as the future of the therapy?
So I think the key take-home message is there are options with transcatheter arterialization of the deep vein system for treating these patients who have no standard option for therapy. And we can have, I think, very good expectations for limb salvage in this group of patients and across all different types of patients. So, every subgroup or subcategorization really seemed to benefit from this procedure. I think that's probably the number one take-home message. And for the future of the therapy, I really think that we're going to increasingly see more patients referred for this. I think we're going to continue to see improved outcomes. I think we're going to continue to see better ways to deal with the wounds that these patients have and getting them to heal quicker. And I really am excited about what I look forward to with this therapy.
Yeah, research is hope. And to me, these patients that have had no hope up to today now have hope. Thousands of patients that were undergoing major amputation here in the United States and worldwide will now have a treatment that could potentially save their leg. And that to me is something that I'm looking forward to.
Well, I want to thank both of you for joining us today and for your contributions and leadership during the study. I mean, it was a long study because of the pandemic. It was a really challenging study, both in its design and the patient population, and it's always engaging and exciting when you're bringing a new therapy. And the communication has been fantastic along the way. Our team has been privileged to work with you all and the other investigators. And thank you for coming in and talking to us today. And thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks.